Wednesday night Bible study. I know you wonder why I always say that. That's because you know you're at First Baptist Church Hazel Bible study. But just in case somebody's, fan through the internet and they run by, that they'll know where we are. So that's it. Now you know. And I worked hard to memorize that line too. We're glad to have you tonight. Let's all stand and we'll sing some praises. She actually told me she was not familiar with this song. That means she didn't listen to Tammy Wynette, and that's against the law. So just saying. That's all. Let's all go down to the river. There's a man walking on the water. Come along with me. Oh, I want to see this man walking on the water. He can raise the dead from the grave, change the water, turn into wine. He can make the lame walk. Make the dumb talk and open up the eyes of the blind. Let's all go down to the river. There's a man walking on the water. Come along with me, for I want to see this man walking on the water. Jesus is the man at the river, and he's washing people's sins away. He can save your soul if you give him control. Be ready for the judgment day. Let's all go down to the river. There's a man walking on the water. Come along with me, for I want to see this man walking on the water. Come along with me, for I want to see this man walking on the water. Woo, amen. Y'all act like you heard that before. I'm proud of you. This is just a little bit older. I think you'll know what. There's in my heart a melody, Jesus whispers sweet and low. Fear not, I am with thee, peace be still, in all love's life ebb and flow. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, keeps me singing as I go. All my life was wrecked by sin and strife. Discord filled my heart with pain. Jesus wept across the broken stream, stirred the slumbering chords again. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, keeps me singing as I go. Soon he's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry sky. I shall make my flight to worlds unknown, I shall reign with him on high. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, keeps me singing as I go. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my ever longing, keeps me singing as I go. Amen. Have a seat.
I was about to sit down and enjoy the Bible study, and I realized, oh, wait, no. Open your Bibles tonight to 2 Kings chapter 7. 2 Kings chapter 7. We're going to look in chapter 7 and chapter 8, two very interesting chapters. I'm not going to say they're happy chapters, but very interesting chapters. Some good things do happen. In fact, we're going to start with a miracle, and a beautiful miracle at that. As you're turning there, this is in chapter 7. As you're turning to chapter 7 in 2 Kings, beginning in verse 1. Remember last week we were in a terrible, not a famine, we were in a terrible siege. The people of Samaria, this is the northern kingdom of Israel, where the king is there in the city. They have been laid siege, that is a foreign army, the Aramean army has surrounded them, and nobody can come in or go out, which means no one can go collect crops or food of any kind, and so there's no commerce, there's no food. And that's what they would do. Instead of trying to knock down walls, because often they couldn't do that, they would just surround the city and seal everybody in until they all died of starvation. And so that's about where they are. If you remember, someone comes to the king. First of all, a donkey's head, it said, would sell for $750. Our equivalent of that. And so that doesn't sound very good to you and I. A donkey's head normally would not be sold for that, be thrown out or whatever. But it was so, everyone was starving. It was so bad. King was walking along one day, and a lady came up to him and asked him for help, and he said, I don't have any food. And she said, no, I don't want food, I want justice. And she then explained to him that she made an agreement with another lady that they would eat her kid one day, and the next day they would eat the other lady's kid. And so she kept her into the bargain. They ate her kid, but the other lady hid her child the next day, didn't keep her into the bargain. So they're eating their own children. And, again, as a society, you've hit rock bottom when you start eating your own children. It's as bad as it could possibly be. The king is outraged, he's furious, and he immediately, instead of repenting, which is the reason they're being surrounded in the first place, God is judging them because of their sinfulness. Instead of repenting from his sins and doing what he needs to do to lift that curse of God, he just blames the prophet Elisha. And so he puts out a death warrant for Elisha, a price on his head, and wants him dead. Then Elisha, so they go to Elisha, both the king and one of the king's men, and he's with some of the town leaders. They're in a building, and the king and the assistant tries to get in, and Elisha says to the king, this time tomorrow, everything will be back to normal, basically. You'll be able to buy all the food you want. You can have all the food you want by this time tomorrow. But the servant of the king says something odd. He says, even if God opens the floodgates, that's just not going to happen, basically. How could that possibly happen? In his lack of faith, Elisha turns to him and says, well, everybody's going to enjoy this except you. You're not going to get to eat any of it. So we're right in the middle of that story, and we come to 2 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. Elisha said, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says, about this time tomorrow, a seah of flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. The officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of the heavens, could this happen? You will see it with your own eyes, answered Elisha, but you will not eat any of it. Remember, I read that little section to you last week as we concluded. King Joram could have turned to the priests of Baal, but they had nothing to say and nothing to offer. So God spoke through his servant and his prophet. Joram wanted something to happen now. He would wait no longer, but Elisha opened his message with tomorrow about this time. And that's quite a message, by the way. He didn't say, look, in 6 months. in 3 weeks, he says, tomorrow, this will all be over. So that's a good way to start a conversation when the king wants to kill you because of the famine or because of the starvation. So what would happen? Food would once more be available. The inflationary prices would fall drastically. The fine flour for the people and the barley for the animals would cost about twice as much as normal times, but reasonable. All right, verse 3. Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, "Why stay here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we will die. And if we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die." At dusk, they got up and went to the camp of the Arameans. When they reached the edge of the camp, not a man was there. For the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to each other, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. Now, this is a miracle, and what's fascinating about this miracle at this point, there's only 4 people that's aware of the miracle. Really 5, Elisha. Elisha doesn't explain how it's going to happen. So these 4 men are lepers, and they're outside the city. The city is shut up tight, but they act as though, or they speak as though if they wanted to, they could go into the city. Things are so bad, I don't think it really matters if lepers are among you or not. Everybody's dying of starvation. Who cares anymore? But the lepers thought logically, we could go into the town. We could go into the city. But what for? There's nothing there. I got a better idea, one of them said. He said, let's go into the camp of the enemy, which, by the way, is fascinating because the army of the enemy, the enemy army has surrounded the city. They could have easily killed all of these lepers, but they didn't. They didn't bother to kill them because they're not protected like the rest of the city, but they didn't kill them. I don't know if they didn't want to get close to them or they just didn't care or wasn't interested. They're obviously not a threat to them. So they're still alive. So I have 2 great lessons from lepers. If you ever hear a preacher preach on this passage, they're probably going to give you something along these lines because they're clear and obvious lessons. Number 1, don't just sit there wallowing in your misery. Do something. Don't just sit there wallowing in your misery. Do something. Everybody was miserable. In fact, it was so bad that really everybody's on the same level at this point with lepers. The biggest problem in the leper's life for years probably was, if you asked them, my biggest problem is I have leprosy. That's no longer their biggest problem. Their biggest problem is they're about to starve to death, and they decided to do something. Now, the people in the town could have done something. The king could have done something, but nobody did. They just starved. These 4 actually did do something, and so don't just sit there wallowing in your misery. Do something. Number 2, if you know something that will save you and everyone else, don't keep it a secret. Look with me in verse 8. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp and entered one of the tents. They ate and drank and carried away silver, gold, and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent and took some of the things from it and hid them also. So point number 2, if you know something that will save you and everyone else, don't keep it a secret. These 4 guys are the only guys that know. They go into the camp, they realize they're all gone. They left everything behind. What a scene this would be. If you're going to make a movie, have a scene with these 4 guys going into a tent, and there's silver and gold and all this food there, and they're starving and they're lepers, and this is the happiest moment of their life. It's got to be. So they're feasting, they're going at it. They're eating everything, they're grabbing the gold, and then they run off and hide some of it, and then they came back a second time, and they started enjoying it as well. Verse 9, then they said to each other, we're not doing right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. For if we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. Now, when he says go at once, what he means is let's go after we've done this a couple times. now that they're full. But what they ultimately realize is this is too good of a thing for us to keep to ourselves. We just can't do that. We have to tell everybody. Paul felt that way about our faith in Christ. One of my all-time favorite movies is a Christmas film called It's a Wonderful Life. In this movie, an angel named Clarence is assigned to a young Jimmy Stewart to help him during a time of great need. I've always liked Clarence. He is unlike any angel you've ever seen or had ever been portrayed until that point. Clarence is not your typical angel. He's actually not an angel. He ain't got his wings yet. He's an angel wannabe, but he's clumsy and feeble a little bit, and he's trying the best he can. He's a lot like you and I in a lot of ways, stumbling along the way. But even though he was clumsy and awkward, he had a great job. He got to be God's messenger. Although Clarence is a fabrication, the Bible shares a number of instances when angels appear here on earth. But they're not here to sightsee. They're always on a mission. You'll never see in the Bible or in all of history loitering angels. Maybe on TV, but not in reality. They're always on a mission. And it is always the same mission. It is God's mission. No angel is ever here because they were in heaven and they thought, I should go do this, or I might go do that. I should go watch out for this or that. They are all here doing exactly and only what God tells them to do. They're on God's mission. The angel's sole purpose here on earth is to represent God, to speak on his behalf, to do his bidding, to be God's ambassador. So we share something in common with angels. According to God's word, we are here to do exactly the same thing. And we spend so much of our time, I spend a lot of my time, you spend your time thinking about what are we going to do? Are we going to go into town? Are we going to go out to eat? Are we going to take that vacation? Are we going to take that job or this career or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera in our life? The truth is, first and foremost, we're not here for any of that. We are here to be God's ambassadors. Now, as we are God's ambassadors, God will give us instructions on where to go and what to do and when to do it. That's God's guidance through the Holy Spirit, but we share that in common with angels. We are here as God's ambassadors. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 19, Paul says it this way. He says to them, "Pray also for me, that whenever I open my mouth, words may be given me, that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly as I should." And so these men realized they had knowledge that would save lives. Literally would save the city, every man, woman, and child there. They could save them. And it's unusual or unique in all of history that a leper can save others. Usually it's just the opposite. And they realize we cannot keep this to ourselves. We have to report it. So the next time you're faced with someone that you know is not a believer in Christ, don't keep knowledge that you know will save them to yourself. So, where was I? Verse 10. So they went out and called to the city gatekeepers and told them, "We went into the Aramean camp, and not a man was there. Not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents left just as they were." The gatekeeper shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. The king got up in the night and said to his officers, I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know we're starving, so they have left the camp to hide in the countryside, thinking they will surely come out, and then we will take them alive and get into the city. One of his officers answered, have some men take 5 of the horses that are left in the city. Their plight will be like that of all the Israelites left here. Yes, they will only be like all of these Israelites who are doomed. So let us send them to find out what happened. And so he has kind of the same ideal as the lepers. These guys aren't going to make it here in the city. And if they go into the camp, and sure enough, all the Arameans are there, the army is there, they're going to kill them, but they're doomed anyway here, so go ahead and send them in just in case. Long shot, just in case they're all gone. Verse 14, so they selected 2 chariots with their horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army. He commanded the drivers, go and find out what has happened. They followed them as far as the Jordan, and they found the whole road strewn with the clothing and equipment of the Arameans that had thrown away in their headlong flight. So the messengers returned and reported to the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a seah of flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, as the Lord had said. Now, unfortunately, I say unfortunately to my curiosity, we don't know the details of exactly what happened with the Aramean army. We don't know exactly what they saw. We do know that they heard what they were sure was a massive army, which obviously was God's army, pursuing them, and it terrified them so much they ran out. And so we know that. They left immediately, left everything there. Left their gold there. They left everything. They left their horses. You'd think you'd get on the horse and ride the horse out of there. They didn't even take the horses. But we know that their panic was even worse than that. Because as these guys walked along or drove along in their chariots, they just saw clothes all over the side of the road. So they're throwing off everything. They are in a complete panic when they left. And what a bizarre sight that would have been to be able to watch that take place, because God terrified them so much. Verse 17, now the king had put the officer in whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gateway. And he died just as the man of God had foretold when the king came down to his house. It happened as the man of God had said to the king. About this time tomorrow, a seah of flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. So why did the people trample him? When you're starving to death so much that you're eating your kids, and you find out that there's unlimited supply of food nearby, a stampede is going to take place. And he happened to be, according to God's providence, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he got ran over. Verse 19, I think it's verse 19. The officer had said to the man of God, look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heaven, could this happen? The man of God replied, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it. And that's exactly what happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died. All right, any comments about chapter 7 before we move on to chapter 8? Yes. Yes, the Arameans were Syrians. They were in the greater region of Syria, and so I don't know what the actual Hebrew word is here, but they're Arameans, but Arameans were Syrians. Does that make sense? Ninevites, for example, Jonah fled, or he went to preach to Nineveh, the Ninevites. They were Assyrians. So, again, from the greater region. So you see them called Assyrians, and you also see them called Ninevites. All right, any other questions? I should have said Syrians just because Syrian is easier for me to say than Arameans. I want to say something else, Arabs or something, I don't know. All right, anybody else? All right, chapter 8. Now Elisha had, let me read this first. Now Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, go away with your family and stay for a while whenever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years. The woman proceeded to do as the man of God said, and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. You need to know two things here. First of all, the author of 2 Kings does not claim to follow a strict chronology here. Now, we're Western-minded people. We like to see everything. I've got a Bible in my office called the Chronological Study Bible. Everything's put in order, because not everything in the Old Testament is put historically in order. They're not arranged that way, but in our Western thinking, we want yesterday to be yesterday, tomorrow to be tomorrow, and it'll all flow. But this actually is a bit of a backflash likely here. This account reminds us of the greatness of God, and we'll see this. The events that follow reveal the sinfulness of people, but this section gives us a reminder that God is great, and he will accomplish his purposes in spite of the sinfulness of people, great or small. The other thing you need to note is in the very beginning, the very first verse, it says, Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, go. Now, if you remember, I believe it was back in chapter 4, that Elisha, every time he came through a particular town, there was a lady there, a couple, and the lady was very kind to him. She always cooked him dinner, and it was a great meal every time he came to town. So one day she said to her husband, he's a man of God. Why don't we put a little room on the roof with a couple of beds for him and his servant, and so he can stay here every time he comes to town. And so he did that. And the wife never asked anything of him, of course, for that, never took payment or anything. He was a man of God. She wanted to honor him, and so they did that for him. So Elisha said to her, hey, what can I do for you? One day he said, how can I repay you your kindness? She said, I don't really need anything. And then his assistant said to Elisha, well, actually, she didn't have any kids. She didn't have a son. And for a Hebrew woman, that was humiliating not to be able to provide a son for your husband. So Elisha just turned to her and said, this time next year, you will hold a son in your arms. Remember that? It's a great miracle, wonderful miracle. So the problem is, she's going to starve to death just like everybody else. And so turns out Elisha said to the woman, or he had said to her, by the way, I have to tell you the rest of the story. One day her son gets a terrible headache out in the fields and he dies. And she's heartbroken and goes to Elisha and says, why did you get my hopes up? And so Elisha brought him back to life. And so this is the person. Now Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, go away with your family and stay for a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years. So the woman proceeded to do this, the man of God said. She and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. Now this is interesting, in part because, of course, the purpose of the famine was judgment from God. And it was a localized thing because the land of the Philistines wasn't that far off. So apparently the Philistines did not have a famine, only the Israelites had a famine, and it lasted for 7 years. All right, verse 3. At the end of the 7 years, she came back from the land of the Philistines and went to the king to beg for her house and land. The king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and had said, tell me about all the great things Elisha has done. Just as Gehazi was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, the woman whose son Elisha had brought back to life came to beg the king for her house and land. Perfect timing. Gehazi said, this is the woman, my lord, the king, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life. So the son is not a boy anymore. He's a young man at this point, 7 years later. Verse 6, the king asked the woman about it, and she told him. Then he assigned an official to her case and said to him, "Give back everything that belonged to her, including all the income from her land from the day she left the country until now." Now, why, you might ask, is this story in there? And I love the Word of God for this very reason. There's no murder or killing here. There's no kingdom at stake. It just puts this in here to let us know that God foresaw her need because she was good to God and God's servant. God blessed her, but he also protected her for those 7 years. He didn't want her to be a part of the suffering that was going to happen because she was a faithful person. It's sad that not more people were told by God, because they were so faithful, to go to the land of the Philistines, but there weren't. It was just her and her family. At the very moment Gehazi was describing this wonderful resurrection miracle, the mother of the child walked into the throne room. By the way, it wasn't uncommon when people had a legal issue like this. Apparently, during her absence, other people just took over her land or started living on her land or started farming her land. And so she came back and realized, I need an official decree from the king so that I can reoccupy my land, because maybe they thought she just abandoned it. So it was common for people to bring these kinds of problems directly to the king, and he would decide how the property should be divided. By the way, our English word for providence, and this was certainly providential, comes from two Latin words, pro and video. Provideo, which together mean to see ahead. God not only knows what lies ahead, but he plans what is to happen in the future and executes his plan perfectly every time. Perhaps a better word is prearrangement. In no way does God's providence interfere with our power of choice and our responsibility for the choices we make and their consequences. We are responsible for what we do, but God already knows everything. God already knows every decision you and I are going to make and everybody's going to make until the end of time. He's already seen it because he's transcendent. He can go back and forth through time. And so for him, it's already all happened, and yet it hasn't happened yet for thousands of years because he is not bound by linear time like us. Anyway, verse 7. Elisha went to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, was ill. When the king was told, the man of God has come all the way up here, he said to Hazael, take a gift with you and go to meet the man of God, consult the Lord through him, ask him, will I recover from this illness? Now this is a completely separate account. The author turns the page or starts a new chapter, as it were, a new story during this time, but it's during the lifetime of Elisha. When God met with the prophet Elijah on when God met with the prophet Elijah on Mount Horeb before he died, do you remember this? He was under the tree. He said, God, just kill me. And God sent an angel, said, get up and made him some food, and you got a journey. And God gave him 3 directives. You can't die. You can't quit. I've got some things for you to do. And there were 3 directives. One of those 3, by the way, I did not remember this. Out of the 3 directives, did he accomplish the 3? No. He only accomplished 1. Can you tell me the 1 directive he got? He actually did. Now, if my chariot of fire is waiting, I'm going to go. I'm going to let somebody else do it. And so Elisha got to do the other 2. The one thing he did was, one of the 3 directives was to anoint Elisha as his successor, which he does. But as a result, those 2 things, the other 2 things, have to be done. And so now it's up to Elisha to do that. And one of those 3 directives was to go and anoint a guy king. And he's now going to do that. It was to anoint Hazael king of Syria. He's in Syria right now, but he's not king. He's just a servant or an assistant. So he was supposed to do that. So now it's time to do that. So Elisha, verse 7, went to Damascus, and the king, his name was Ben-Hadad, and we've seen him a number of times before. He was sick. The king was told, the man of God has come all the way up here. Now, the king is aware that Elisha is a prophet. So he wants to know. He says, take a gift with you and go to meet the man of God. Consult the Lord through him and ask, will I recover from this illness? Okay, all right. Do you remember this story? It's a hoot. Verse 9, Hazael went to meet Elisha, taking with him as a gift 40 camel loads of all the finest wares of Damascus. Now, I don't know if this is Tupperware or what kind of wares it is, but it's good stuff. And so 40 camel loads, I don't know exactly what a camel load is, but it sounds like a lot to me. 40 camel loads, how would you fit that in your house? What's he supposed to do with all that stuff? Anyway, so he brings all of these gifts. He went in and stood before him and said, your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to ask, will I recover from this illness? Now, did you catch what he called the king? Your son. He says this to Elisha, the prophet. He said, your son, the king. Now, the king isn't his son. It's a sign of respect to Elisha. And he's not even in Israel here. He's getting respect because God has done miracles through him. Everybody knows it. Even the pagan countries know it. And so he's getting some respect, as he should. And God is getting respect. So your son, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, sent me to ask, will I recover from this illness? So it took faith and courage for Elisha to travel to Damascus, by the way. After all, he had often thwarted Syria's plans for raiding, and by the way, Damascus is part of Syria, for raiding Israel's border towns, and he had humiliated the Syrian army by leading them into Samaria and sending them home with full stomachs but empty hands back in chapter 6, if you remember that from a few weeks back. Because of Elisha, the Syrian army had fled from Samaria, and the Jewish people were able to loot their camp that we just read in chapter 7. So all of this happened against the Syrians, and now here the Syrian king is being nice to Elisha because he wants to know the truth. But not only that, Elisha had in his favor to the Syrians, Elisha had healed Naaman the Syrian of his leprosy back in chapter 5. And when Elisha brought the Syrian raiding party to Samaria, he showed them mercy and he saved their lives. So that probably meant something to the king. The fact that Ben-Hadad, the Syrian king, was very ill and wanted help from the Lord made Elisha's arrival more significant. This was a pagan Gentile king seeking the help of a prophet of Jehovah. But perhaps the conversion of Naaman had something to do with it. Even more, Ben-Hadad sent Hazael, one of his high officials, to meet Elisha and give him expensive gifts. The gifts were probably more like bribes, and the king was hoping that his generosity would cause Elisha to give him a good answer. Now, here's the irony of the whole thing. Have you caught it yet? Elisha is going there to anoint the king, the next king, because this was an instruction that had been given to Elijah, his master, and now he's I would say stuck with this. He has received this directive to go to Syria and anoint the next king, which means the current king isn't going to make it, right? The next king is going to make it, and the next king happens to be the very servant that King Ben-Hadad sends out to give him the bribe, to give him the gifts. Does that make sense? So it's a short triangle here. And so the first guy that Elisha meets is the next king. Now, nobody knows that. The king doesn't know that. The guy doesn't even know that. Only Elisha knows that. And so he comes up to Elisha, the next king comes up to Elisha and says, hey, is the king going to live? And so what is his answer? Verse 10. Elisha answered, go and say to him, you will certainly recover. But the Lord has revealed to me that he will in fact die. He stared at him with a fixed gaze until Hazael felt ashamed. Then the man of God began to weep. Now there's a lot going on in that 2 verses there. What on earth? What on earth? Elisha says, okay, here's the prophecy. Go tell him what he says is, go and say to him, you will certainly recover. In other words, in fact, well, let me read this commentary. Elisha's reply appears to be deliberately ambiguous, for the Hebrew text can be read, you will certainly recover, or you will certainly not recover. The prophet seems to be saying, this is the theologian's interpretation of this, of the Hebrew, the sickness will not take his life, but he will die by another means. This appears to be what he's saying to the servant. Good news and bad news. The good news is, no, the sickness is not going to kill him. The bad news is, he's going to die anyway. But he doesn't say how he's going to die, which is really ironic. Do you remember how he dies? He gets murdered by this guy. Anyway, as soon as the guy finds out he's the next king, might as well go at it. Okay, all right. As a high officer of the king, Hazael wanted to give the king good news. So when he goes back to the king, he did not convey to him the second part of the message. Elisha was not lying to Hazael. Hazael's question, will the king recover from his sickness, was answered yes and no. No, the sickness will not kill the king, but yes, something else will kill him. Verse 12. And so as he's telling him this, Elisha starts crying. I don't know of another time we see the prophet crying like this. Why would he cry? Well, verse 12. Why is my Lord weeping? Asked Hazael. Because I know the harm you will do to the Israelites, he answered. You will set fire to their fortified places, kill their young men with the sword, dash their little children to the ground, and rip open their pregnant women. Wow. Oh my goodness. Now this is a hard thing. You know, you and I think, well, it'd be cool to be the prophet. No, it's heart-wrenching. Because God has revealed to him the future, and even revealing to him the future that Hazael is going to be a horrible king, and specifically a brutal, ruthless king to the Israelites, he still calls Elisha to go and anoint him as the next king. That's a hard job. You would think, Elisha, if you and I were there like Elisha, would we not be tempted to just simply forgo the explanation, take out a knife and cut the guy's throat right then and there, be done with it? But that's not what God had decided to do. God's in charge, not Elisha. And I commend Elisha for this. He did the difficult deed that he had to do, but it tore him up to do it. That's why he was crying. So he says to Hazael, and Hazael goes, no. Verse 13, Hazael said, how could your servant, a mere dog, accomplish such a feat? The Lord has shown me that you will become king of Aram, answered Elisha. So Elisha stared at Hazael as though reading his mind and heart, and then the prophet broke into weeping. The Lord had shown him some of the violence and bloodshed that Hazael would perpetrate, brutal acts of warfare. Hazael's reply indicated that he recognized that he was subordinate and in the government and wondered where he would get the authority to do those things. In calling himself the dog, did you see that? He referred to himself as a dog. He wasn't referring to a vicious nature. Am I some kind of dog that I would do these terrible things? But rather that he was a nobody, a humble servant of the king, a man without such great authority. Elisha's reply stunned him. Hazael would have all the authority he needed because he would become the king of Syria. So it doesn't take him long. He didn't go back home and spend a couple of months or a couple of years thinking, maybe I'm going to be king. No. Now that he's been anointed, we don't actually have, that was the instruction that he anointed him as king. We don't actually have a description of him pouring oil on him here, but that's probably what happened because he's making this official announcement, you're going to be the next king. And being a man, I went right to his head immediately. Verse 14. Then Hazael left Elisha and returned to his master. When Ben-Hadad asked, what did Elisha say to you? Hazael replied, he told me that you would certainly recover. But the next day, he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and spread it over the king's face so that he died. Then Hazael succeeded him as king. He didn't make it one day. He just went home that night and thought, oh man, I'm going to get him while he's still sick. And so he murdered him the next day. And obviously, you notice, he did not convey the whole message, just part of it. If the king is going to die anyway, Hazael might have reasoned, then why wait? Why not take his life now, become king sooner? When the human heart is bent on evil, it can invent all kinds of excuses. As Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? Verse 16, in the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, when Jehoshaphat was king of Judah, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, began his reign as king of Judah. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for he married the daughter of Ahab. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Nevertheless, for the sake of his servant David, the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah. He had promised to maintain a lamp for David and his descendants forever. And again, we go to a different story here, and we go backwards again in the timeline a little bit, because now, while the story of Israel has been told for this period of the life of Elijah, now it's going to complete the story of Judah during the life of Elijah. And so it goes back in time a little bit to talk about that. So we're done with the northern kingdom for right now. Now it's the southern kingdom of Judah. The one thing you need to remember about Judah is that's where the line of David is, and so there was some protection by God to make sure that line of David continued until the birth of Christ. So that's why we have a completely different story here. And it reminds us that this king, the king of Judah, married the daughter of Ahab, so they were connected. Ahab was his father-in-law, Jezebel was his mother-in-law, and so he ended up being a rotten king too. Even though Ahab and Jezebel were up in the north, and he's down in the south, because they were related, he ended up being no good. So, for 5 years, Jehoram served as co-regent with his father, Jehoshaphat, and when Jehoshaphat died, he took the throne. And he married Athaliah, which was a daughter of Ahab. Okay, verse 20. In the time of Jehoram, Edom rebelled against Judah and set up its own king. So Jehoram went to Zair with all of his chariots. The Edomites surrounded him and his chariot commanders, but he rose up and broke through by night. His army, however, fled back home. That's a crummy army. To this day, Edom has been in rebellion against Judah. Libnah revolted at the same time. As for the other events of Jehoram's reign, and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoram rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of David, and Ahaziah, his son, succeeded him as king. In the 12th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 1 year, which is why we don't allow 22-year-olds to become president. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel. He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was related by marriage to Ahab's family. Ahaziah went with Joram, son of Ahab, to war against Hazael, king of Aram. So there's Hazael there at Ramoth Gilead. The Arameans wounded Joram So King Joram returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds the Arameans had inflicted on him at Ramoth in his battle with Hazael, king of Aram. So he has this battle, the two kings go and battle the king of the Syrian king. And while he's in this battle, Joram is wounded. So Joram goes back to town to heal up. It says, then Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to Jezreel to see Joram, son of Ahab, because he had been wounded. And this is confusing in part because there's Joram and Jehoram, and then Jezreel, and then Jezebel, and there's a lot of J's going on. So when he became king, Jehoram followed the example of Jezebel, he murdered all of his brothers and anybody who might threaten his authority. His father had given each of the sons a fortified city to rule, and Jehoram didn't want them to unite against him. Instead of calling them together to pray and worship God at the temple and to seek his blessing, he followed the ways of Ahab and Jezebel and ruled by the sword, killed all of his brothers. Jehoram wanted his brothers out of the way so they couldn't oppose his policy of promoting the worship of Baal. Jezebel had won again. Of course, God could have destroyed the king and his kingdom, but for David's sake, he kept the dynasty alive. But God brought several defeats to Judah, including the revolt of Edom and Libnah. David had defeated and subdued Edom, but now Edom had broken free of Judah, and now they're a problem. All right, we're going to stop right there for tonight, and we'll take up there next week. Very interesting thing that happens. So next week, we're going to see one guy kill two kings. How about that? I don't know of another time you see one guy kill two kings in the Bible or in history, but one guy does it. So, of course, he becomes king. We'll see that next week. Any comments before we end our Bible study? Yes?
I ask a lot of questions.
No, go right ahead.
You had 2 points, and I didn't get the third one. Yeah.
I had 2 points.
You had 3 points, and I didn't get the third one.
From God to Elijah, 3 things he was supposed to do.
Oh, yes, that's exactly right. He said, I want you to anoint this king. I want you to anoint your successor. And then the third one, and I don't remember. Does anybody remember?
The first one he did, but the second and third one is the predecessor.
Now, I do remember this, though I don't know what it is. I do remember that Elisha did it.
Yeah.
He did the last 2. But it's a very good question. Any of my Bible scholars out here can answer? All right, I'm going to open next week with that answer. How about that? All right, let's take a look at our prayer sheet for the week. It's